Okay, well, hello everyone. I hope you all are well and interested in moving on to the final section of our course. We will now be exploring Book 3, the third book in our trilogy, which is entitled The Rise and Fall of Freedom. Now, in this volume, we examine the deeper roots of this quest for freedom that has characterized Western society and American society in particular over time. And it's an interesting question. I mean, where did this passion for freedom come from? We take it for granted as Americans. It's built into our DNA. It was at the basis of the American Revolution and founding. We think that, all men are endowed by their Creator with the unalienable right to life, liberty, and property, and the pursuit of happiness. But we shouldn't take it for granted because, as we've already noted, the freedom, as historically achieved and understood in the American tradition, is the rarest of human phenomena. Almost no one who has lived over the course of at least the last 5,000 years has lived in what we would regard as freedom. Most people instead have lived under the thumb and at the direction of people who managed to be in positions of coercive power over them, whether it was in the master-slave relationship in the ancient world, or as serfs under the feudal lords, or in the modern time under the totalitarian rule of various dictators that have marred the landscape of the 20th and into the 21st century. And even today, depending on who you read, the number of people currently alive right now across the world who live under a regime that could be remotely described as free has been estimated as being as low as 20 to 40%. So freedom, contrary to our expectations, has actually been a rarity in human history. So it is really a very interesting question of where this quest for freedom came from in Western and American society, because it is not the norm. It's a question that needs to be answered. Fortunately, modern scholarship gives us the answer. We know the answer to this question. If you just were to do a disinterested study of, well, where did this quest for freedom come from? Where did freedom become so significant in human society that it actually managed to shape the institutions of a society? You will find an answer. The quest for freedom is located in a very narrow geographical region of the world. And if you were in class, I'd ask you to guess. What do you think? Where do you think freedom came from? Well, since we're not in class, I will just get to the point and tell you the answer. And the answer is what we would today call Europe. European civilization is the origin of the quest for freedom. We can see it localized in various locations that eventually led to the development of modern Europe and so forth. And of course, America is an offshoot of European civilization in large part. And so we know that it came from Europe. So the question is, how did Europe come into being? What made Europe Europe? Well, we have to go into a little bit of history here. And we have to go back at least as far as the late Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had been around for 1,000 years, well, at least between the Republic and the Empire, Rome had been around for at least 1,000 years, founded in 753 BC. And the official end of the Roman Empire in the West is usually dated 476 AD. But the collapse of Rome in the West didn't happen overnight. It was an extended period that proceeded over several centuries. And back in the 3rd century AD, things were pretty bad in the Roman Empire. Famine, wars, violence. Of the 27 emperors of the period, only 4 of them died a natural death. The other were killed by the military and so forth. It was a very dangerous time. Massive numbers of people had amassed in the cities, propertyless, hopeless, no future. Anyway, so the chaos was addressed by the emperor of the time, Emperor Diocletian. So in order to get a firmer grip on things, he decided he would divide the Roman Empire, which by then was the largest empire the world had ever seen, geographically speaking. So he divided it up into 4 different administrative districts and wanted to put someone in charge to kind of get a firmer handle on the disorder. Eventually, those 4 districts coalesced into 2 districts, the so-called Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire, which is the origin of our civilization, Western civilization, was headquartered in Rome and Ravenna, cities there. And the Eastern Roman Empire, the headquarters of the Eastern Roman Empire was in the old Greek city of Byzantium, which after the Emperor Constantine became emperor, he changed its name to Constantinople in the 4th century. And he wanted to make Constantinople the new Rome. Christianity had been made the official religion of the Roman Empire in 395 AD, and Constantine had big plans for the development of Constantinople. And over this period, increasingly, Roman administrative authority and military might was increasingly shifted to the eastern portion of the empire, progressively leaving the western portion weaker and weaker. So much so that by the 5th century, the early 5th century, 410 is a significant date, the various so-called barbarian or Germanic tribes that had been pressing around the frontiers of the Roman Empire for centuries and had finally gained admittance, they became more increasingly assertive, and in 410, the unthinkable happened. One of these barbarian tribes marched into Rome, the Eternal City, and sacked Rome, and they met no resistance. There was no Roman military to resist them. This was a horrific and traumatic experience, but symbolic of what was to come, because these tribes, these barbarian tribes who had been allowed to settle on the Roman territory for various reasons, mainly because the Romans needed soldiers, and they made a deal with the tribal peoples. You can live here if you agree to serve in our military, which they eagerly took advantage of. But anyway, they grew in size. They had lots of children. The population of the barbarian peoples, the Germanic peoples, the same thing, grew. And as I said, they became increasingly assertive, finally sacking Rome in 410. They kept moving out into the territory of the Western Roman Empire, which again, by now was pretty much undefended by Roman military or political power. And they conquered various territories. And so much so that by 476, one of the barbarian chieftains, a guy, it's not important, named Odoacer, he came across the golden insignia of the Roman emperor, and he found it, and he sent it to the emperor in the Eastern Roman Empire, and he said, I'm sending this back to you, this is yours. You won't need it here anymore because we are in charge now. So that's why 476 is usually considered the end of the Roman Empire in the West. Now, in the East, the Eastern Roman Empire, by contrast, remained very strong for many centuries thereafter. It developed into the Byzantine civilization, took a different route than developments would in the Western portion. We are concerned with the Western portion because, again, we are heirs to Western civilization, and if you've ever wondered why Western civilization is called Western civilization, it's precisely because of the events I just described, that the civilization that we understand today as the West, mainly European civilization and its offshoots, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, is the civilization that developed over many centuries in the former territories of the old Western Roman Empire after it fell in the 5th century AD. Okay, now why is this important when we're looking for the quest for freedom? We said that the quest for freedom can be located to the geographical area known as Europe, and we're trying to see how Europe came into being. Back in the 5th century, there was territory there, but there wasn't any European civilization. What happens in the 5th century, there were basically 3 chief elements that eventually, over the following centuries, blended and combined and intermingled with each other to produce what, certainly at least by the 11th century, was a recognizably new civilization that we would call European civilization. And those 3 elements were the remnants of the older Greco-Roman culture, and not everybody died immediately just because Rome withdrew its power from the West. the culture of these disparate barbarian tribes, these Germanic tribes, who were not unified in any sense. They had different languages, different cultures, different political organization, different laws, and so forth. They actually competed and fought amongst each other for control. So we had the remnants of the Greco-Roman civilization, the cultures of the barbarian tribes, and the third player that would prove to be definitive, determinative in shaping the civilization that developed in these territories. And that was what's usually called the Latin Church, Latin Christianity. Because you see, by this time, by the time that the Emperor Diocletian split up Rome into the western and eastern portions, Christianity had also developed into two distinct traditions. The so-called Latin Christianity that was headquartered in Rome, and whose head was the Pope, as it is today, the Roman Catholic Church of today. And in the East, we had the Greek Orthodox Church, still around, whose head is the Patriarch of Constantinople, still is today. The Christian churches differed in certain respects with respect to certain doctrine, certainly with respect to language, Latin in the West, Greek in the East, with their leadership, the Pope versus the Patriarch and so forth. And the Eastern Church would go on, as I said, to contribute to the development of Byzantine civilization that followed the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. But in the West, the Latin Church faced very different historical circumstances than the Greek Orthodox Church in the East. In the West, the Church had to confront not the continuing power of the Roman state, but rather all of these various tribal chieftains and the breakdown of civilization, which didn't happen overnight, but little by little, the light of civilization starts to get dimmer in the so-called dark ages of Western civilization. 6th century, 7th, 8th, 9th, that was sort of the low point, and then things start to revive around the 10th century and afterwards. So the church found itself in a very precarious position. First of all, the church of the time was staffed by the most educated and cultured period of the era. Most of the members of the church hierarchy came from the educated Roman classes. The church was the carrier of a higher culture within the context of the barbarian cultures, and led by very able and energetic persons. But it was confronted with this problem of how to survive in a world that was increasingly rough and tumble. Without the Roman administration of law, things started to break down, security, order. We see gradually the light of civilization, as we said, getting dimmer. Trade and commerce start to decline because of lack of order, lack of law and justice, and things of that nature. Education, all the great achievements of the Roman Empire could not possibly be carried on by the members of these barbarian tribes, who were not evil, but ignorant. They were uncivilized. They didn't have written languages or written law or anything like that. There was no way they could possibly duplicate or continue the high cultural achievements of late Rome. So the church was in this position of having to confront these barbarian leaders for its survival. So early on, so eventually these three elements commingled, as I said, to form what we understand as Western civilization. Greco-Roman culture, the culture of the barbarian tribes, and the culture of Latin Christianity in the West, the Christian church in the West. And what happened was, now in the East, let me just mention, things were different for the Eastern Church. The Eastern Church had to deal with a renewed and highly strengthened Roman administrative state. Remember, we said increasingly Roman might had been shipped into the Eastern Roman Empire. And so they had to deal with Rome, not with hodgepodge of barbarian tribes. And this leads us to the main point that we want to discuss when we talk about why freedom emerged in the West. The short answer, as I'm going to explain to you, is Christianity or biblical religion. But Christianity only had the effect of leading to the development of free institutions in the western portion of the Roman Empire, Western civilization. In the East, it did not. Free institutions did not emerge in those areas, and the people remained in a state of submission. Serfdom and feudalism were common all the way up. Russia still had serfs in the 20th century, for example. So as we're going to be talking about the reason why Christianity led to the development of free institutions, we have to confine that strictly to the western portion of the Roman Empire. Christianity did not have the same effect in the East, the Orthodox Church in the East. And why is that? The reason has to do with the different historical circumstances confronted by the churches in both areas. In the West, as we said, the Latin Church had to confront not the power of mighty Rome, but these various tribal chieftains. In the East, the Greek Orthodox Church, again, remained under the authority of the still powerful Roman state. And what the Romans did in the East, in the Eastern Empire, was to continue the pre-Christian or pagan understanding of the proper relationship between religion and government. This becomes very central. Now, what was that? In the pagan world, for thousands of years, as far back as you go, from Mesopotamia to Egypt to Greece to Rome, wherever you look, there was the same understanding of the relationship between what we would call church and state, although these are modern terms, but that refers to church and state, religion and government. And what was the relationship between these two entities? Well, in the ancient or pagan world, they made no distinction between the two. Religion and government were the same thing. This understanding that they are distinct, the reason we all think that they are is because we are heirs of Christian civilization. This is a Christian idea that, as Christ put it, to render unto God that which belongs to God and unto Caesar that which belongs to Caesar. That's a revolutionary idea within the historical context of the era. The pagans didn't know didn't really understand what that meant, because in all cases, I mean, think of the Egyptian pharaoh. He was not just a secular ruler, he was also himself worshipped as a god. In Greece, the polis, the political community, another name for the polis was the ecclesia, the church. In Rome, the Roman emperor was not just the head of the Roman state, the secular state. One of his other titles was the Pontifex Maximus. He was the high priest of the Roman religion. In any event, in all cases in the pagan world, the pre-Christian world, there was no distinction was made between religion and government. Well, Christianity changes that, and we are the beneficiaries of that great distinction.